From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and welcome once more. Coming up today during our cattle market segment from Oklahoma State University, Derrell Peel. Among other things, Derrell will discuss the ongoing drought in large parts of the U.S., which he thinks could end up being a pivotal point in the cattle cycle, affecting the industry as a whole. More on that next. Also today, K-State's Gregg Hanzlicek talks about an unusual condition in young nursing beef calves that's turning up in Kansas cow-calf operations currently. It's a dietary condition, he says, that's causing calf illness and even some calf losses. He'll talk about what you producers can do in response. And later, this week's wildlife management segment with K-State's Charlie Lee. Plus more here on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Tuned into Agriculture Today, and good to be back with you following the Memorial Day holiday. And we'll open up with a look at the cattle market trends, and contributing this time is Derrell Peel, livestock economist out of Oklahoma State University. In a few moments, we'll key in on some thoughts that Derrell's been pulling together on dry weather, not necessarily right here in the Central Plains, but particularly in the western and northern parts of the U.S., and possible lingering ramifications for the cattle industry. More on that later. This past week, Derrell, in the trade, well, something you can say for the fed cattle market, it has been consistent for a long while.
It sure has. You know, we're obviously capped right now with, you know, the capacity issues really limiting things. There's plenty of cattle available. We would like to work through them faster. We are working through them. But in the short run, there's plenty of cattle, all the cattle that the packers can handle right now. And so the market is just staying right where it is. And it's not going to change immediately, but it will eventually change things a little bit. It's just going to take a little bit more time.
Might come back to that in a moment as well. Feeder cattle trade, it looked like prices, at least at the Kansas auctions, gained a little ground last week.
Yeah, I think so. Oklahoma auctions as well appeared to pick up just a little bit this past week. Yeah, I think some of it is just related to the fact that we have gotten some good rains in some areas. Pastures are looking pretty good. You know, if you haven't had too much rain, hay potential looks good to rebuild some of our hay stocks that we pulled down over the winter. And so I think there's just, some general grazing demand for feeder cattle.
Some more on the fundamentals. You noted this as well in an article that slaughter weights have been on the decline. And that would seem to be a positive sign for the market as far as currentness.
It is. It's one of the things we're watching to see when we kind of get caught up a little bit on this fed cattle situation. The weights have kind of bounced around a little bit. They did come down some. They actually popped back up for a week or two, and they're kind of trending back down again. So it's pretty clear that we're still working on that. We haven't turned the corner yet to get ahead of this thing. And these carcass weights are pretty close to year-ago levels, but if you'll remember, this time last year, they were way heavier than the year before that because we were so backed up at this time of the year because of the pandemic reductions in slaughter. So it really is a little bit like that situation right now in that, again, feedlots are not as current as they'd like to be, and we're going to have to work through a few more weeks, I think, to get to the point where we'll see that. And one of the things we'll be watching in that process will be these carcass weights.
Right. On the demand side, well, boxed beef seems to be doing just fine, and we are into the, quote, grilling season now, the Memorial Day weekend, considered the unofficial kickoff for that. So things are looking pretty solid right there yet, Derrell?
Absolutely. I tell you, beef demand looks good. In fact, the entire protein complex looks good. You can look at pork and poultry products and see some of the same thing, but particularly in beef, we've had a tremendous run of these wholesale box beef prices, and I know it's being reflected in retail prices as well. Tremendously strong demand, and it's not because we have any lack of supply. If you look at the first 19 weeks of the year, I think it is, we're up 6 to 7% from 2019 levels. Again, I'm not comparing it to last year because obviously we were way down at this time last year, but compared to 2 years ago, we're putting plenty of meat on the market. And so it has to be demand-driven. Both domestic demand and I think international demand are contributing to that. So consumers are paying up. They're pent up. They're ready to get out and grill. They're ready to get out and eat a steak in a restaurant. I think all of those things are playing into it right now.
Do you see any potential hiccups at all in at least domestic beef demand forthcoming?
Well, there's always some potential, and of course, being an economist, I guess we're always looking for trouble. But at the same time, the economy is growing very strong right now. We are opening things up more and more all the time. I don't see any immediate threats to that. Frankly, the wholesale beef values have gone higher than I would have expected them to. And again, we know it's not a supply issue at this point, so the demand is clearly there, and I don't really see any reason for that to change anytime soon.
And the export side, no real new numbers of late, but that seems to be in fairly good stead as well.
Yeah, it is. The numbers we have for the first 3 or 4 months of the year, 3 months, I guess, were quite strong, particularly the March numbers. We will get April numbers here in another week or so and confirm that. But again, just based on what you see of these wholesale values and some of the product values that we know are involved in the export markets, it looks like that demand is also very strong and certainly contributing to this total package of strength that we see in the demand side.
Well, back to that slaughter capacity issue, which once more is the key reason, it sounds, by most, if not all accounts, for the steadiness, so to say, in the fed cattle trade. Will packers get caught up to the point where they'll be bidding more assertively for finished cattle anytime soon?
They will, and what's going to happen, the capacity is what it is, and we're actually utilizing it very well, as near as I can tell. If you look at average weekly slaughter, again, for the first 19 weeks of the year, we're actually ahead of the pace that we were in 2019. And so, it's not that we have reduced slaughter. It's just that there's more cattle ready than we can slaughter right now. So eventually, the numbers will sort of fall out from under the capacity, if you will. As we work through these numbers, we will eventually pull the numbers down to where the capacity is not a binding constraint. And that'll allow then the market to go back to, sort of working the way we expect it to. And it'll certainly help rebalance these fed cattle prices to the wholesale market a little more typically once we get to that point. No. It's tricky to say exactly how long that's going to take. Again, I think we've got several more weeks ahead of us. We've kind of said all along this year that the first half of the year was going to have some bumps in the road and the second half looked better. I think it's going to take probably into the third quarter for sure, and maybe much of the third quarter before we get to that point. But, we're certainly watching it on a week-by-week basis.
Well, a little over a week ago or so, you authored an article on the drought conditions, as opposed to what we've seen in the recent 2 weeks here in the Central Plains. There are areas not too far from us that are still struggling with ultra-dry weather. The West in general, parts of the Northern Plains likewise. And you think that this could have lasting impact on the cattle market. You might outline that for us.
You bet. Obviously those producers that are caught in drought are being impacted. Many of them have been impacted for many months. So, most of last year in some parts of the country, and others a little more recently. And we're hearing stories now, anecdotes from my colleagues and so on in the Northern Plains, for example, that we are moving significant numbers of cows out of North Dakota and, eastern Montana, those kind of places. And the point here to producers that are not caught in the drought is to keep an eye on that because, we could see things that impact the broader cattle market, even if you're not having to deal with the drought directly. And, the first impact might well be that we would see some general market impacts on cull cow prices. We're kind of at the seasonal peak right now, typically, and we normally hold that through about July and then start tailing off into our fall low. But that drop-off could happen sooner if we see significant numbers of cows come. So that's a more short-term effect, but a broader market impact. The other impact that we have to watch is to see whether or not we actually liquidate enough cows to, in general, sort of change the trajectory of the entire cattle industry from a cyclical standpoint. We've been kind of drifting lower the last couple of years in beef cow numbers, but not a really pronounced liquidation. This would obviously could potentially represent a more accelerated liquidation, and that would have long-term implications for overall cattle numbers and calf crops and beef production in the coming years. And so, producers should be aware of that potential and see how it develops, and then be prepared to maybe think about how that impacts their, sort of strategic planning for the next couple of years.
I'll put you on the spot. Do you think that we will see, in fact, that shift in the trajectory of the numbers, given that dryness doesn't tend to turn very fast, no faster than, say, a steamship on the water?
Well, that's right. And I'm very concerned for a couple of reasons. Now, I will say that oftentimes it takes a very large event, a long and prolonged drought, to actually precipitate the kind of thing that has those sort of overall market impacts. But this time of the year is particularly critical. I mean, we're early in the growing season, and in those areas that are dry, if they don't get some relief right away, they're going to lose much of their forage and pasture and hay potential for this year. Mm-hmm. So, even if rains come a little bit later, it may be too late in some cases. So, I would say the odds are significantly higher that we could see those kind of broader market impacts given where we are in the drought at this time of the year. If this were already August and it looked like this, I probably wouldn't be as concerned about it. But right now, I think it's something we have to watch very carefully. We have seen beef cow slaughter accelerate in the last 3 or 4 weeks of data, and that's a national number. So if that persists for several more weeks or many more weeks, definitely it will change the overall situation for the cattle industry.
This has all the markings of an interesting summer coming our way, as per the cattle markets. We appreciate the input on this. Derrell, thanks. We'll talk again in about 4 weeks.
Sounds good.
He's Derrell Peel, livestock economist out of Oklahoma State University, and with this week's cattle market commentary on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, another visit about an aspect of bovine health management that in this series we've really not discussed before, but it's coming to the attention of the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University. Again, over from that laboratory is the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit, Gregg Hanzlicek of K-State. This is a cow-calf issue, and more specifically, Gregg, a calf dietary condition in the spring-born animals. What's going on out there?
Well, the disease we're talking about is commonly known one of two ways. People call it purple gut or call it enterotoxemia. Some people call it overeating disease, which is actually a different organism than the one we're going to talk about today, or a different class of organism. But, yeah, this is a disease that's we find in very young calves from a few days of age to several months of age. And it presents itself as maybe one or two animals, but the interesting thing is we've had some calls from western Kansas where multiple calves in several herds have experienced this disease. Some of them have died from this disease. So it's a little bit different this year from what we're seeing.
Then the mechanics of it, what's the nature of this disease that's leading to these issues we'll talk about?
Well, like you said, it is a dietary issue, and the organism that is responsible for this is called Clostridium perfringens, and we're going to lump A and C together in this scenario. And those are organisms that are in the ground, but they're also normally found in the intestines of lots of species, including calves. And what happens is these bacteria live on sugars and starches. And so when the calf consumes a large amount of sugar and starch, which would be the milk, then those bacteria reproduce very, very quickly, and they reduce a toxin, an exotoxin, out of their cell wall. And these toxins then get into the bloodstream, and we can have inflammation, we can have circulatory shock, and eventually we can have heart failure. And so the diet brings it on, but it affects a normal bacteria that we're never going to get rid of. It's just a normal inhabitant.
So these are serious results, obviously, and to the point of calf losses, you say?
Absolutely. We've had multiple calf losses. Typically, the clinical signs are we might see a calf that's mildly bloated. Sometimes they might have a diarrhea with or without blood. But a lot of times this occurs and we don't see the clinical signs, and what we find are dead calves. Mm-hmm. And classically, the complaint is it's our biggest, growthiest calves that are affected by this disease. And so we're thinking, well, if they're the biggest, growthiest calves, they're probably on the cows that are producing the most milk.
This is instigated then by the intake, and what's accelerating that intake?
Well, that's what we don't understand. A lot of times we think when we see these outbreaks, it's because we've had a storm where the cows and the calves are all bunched up together. The calves aren't nursing. The storm goes away. Now the calves are extremely hungry. They consume more milk than they normally would. We've seen it in cases where producers actually separated the cows from the calves and synchronized the cows for AI. And then when they put the cows and calves back together, the calves again were hungry. Talking to a couple really good practitioners in western Kansas, we've kind of come to the conclusion that what we're seeing out there may be due to all the moisture and how quickly and how much abundance of grass there is. And it may be if these cows are just milking tremendously high volume of milk, and the calves are just consuming more milk.
And the richness of that grass is contributing to the volume and perhaps the richness of the milk itself? We don't know, but that's the only thing that we can come up. Why this year? What's different from other years? Why are we seeing more and more cases within herds? And that's just one of the noticeable things is that we don't measure the milk production in a beef cow, obviously, but it sure looks like those cows are milking extremely, extremely well. Well, it's a condition that obviously is costly to a producer if it takes hold. Is there any chance of a treatment that's effective against this?
The treatments are usually unsuccessful, and that's because commonly the clinical sign is death. But there are some treatments that, if these calves are caught early, are effective. Frontline is going to be an antibiotic, and typically that's going to be penicillin. But just a reminder to the producers, when we do that, we're not doing anything against the toxin, which is causing the problem. We're just trying to keep the bacteria in check. Producers will also, or veterinarians will also maybe add some charcoal, orally charcoal, because charcoal absorbs the toxins, IV fluids. There's multiple things out there that people will use. And some are successful. Most are not very successful at all.
It sounds like it's not something easily overcome with a treatment then.
It isn't. And unfortunately, on the cow-calf side, there's not a whole lot we can do for prevention other than what we'll get into in a little bit here.
Well, let's go right to that. Are there steps that one could have taken in retrospect to avert this?
Well, something I failed to mention is that we talked about usually it's because of a excess ingestion of starch and sugars. Sometimes when we do see this syndrome in a dry lot cow-calf situation, and we think that what sets it off are the calves are actually exposed to high levels of this bacteria because there's been some construction or something to disturb the soil in the pen. But in that case, just don't do any construction if you're dry lot and you've got young calves. But from a practical standpoint, for most places, try not to do your keep your cows and your calves separated. But other than that, all we can do is depend on vaccinations. And then we've got some good vaccines for the C, but we don't have a vaccine for the Clostridium type A. It's no longer on the market. So vaccinations is probably the best way to go.
So anything in particular that a producer needs to know about those vaccine protocols then?
Well, there's a couple ways we can go about protecting calves against Clostridium perfringens A and C. And one is, which is a tried and true method, is to vaccinate the cows when they're making that colostrum, which would be in that 30 to 60 days prior to calving. I realize that a lot of producers do not want to run those heavy cows through the chute, heavy with calf. So vaccinating them at preg check in the fall is an alternative, which does work. The other thing that you'll see producers do is actually use the 7-way Clostridiums, which again has the C but doesn't have the A in it. We'll vaccinate these calves at birth or when they tag them. Now, most of our vaccines that have the C are not labeled for vaccinating very young calves, certainly under a few months. There is one out there that is labeled 3 days of age and older, but people are still using the vaccine. So that's an alternative, and we can discuss the effectiveness of that protocol some other time. But those are the two things that we believe the producer, one or the other, is something important to do to try to prevent this disease.
Because it's, Greg, somewhat shrouded in mystery, this condition, obviously one should work with their practitioner closely on this.
Absolutely. Work with the practitioner as far as what vaccine to use, the timing of the vaccine, and all those kind of things. Absolutely. If
a cow-calf operator has not yet encountered this, but are a little worried that it might occur, would it be worthwhile to go ahead and take these preventative steps?
That's a great question. I don't know that I would get all the animals in and run them through the chute and give them a 7-way or a C&D Clostridium injection. I think I would just plan on next year, let's make sure that we're vaccinating the cows prior to calving, either in the fall or in the spring.
But if you have an unusual and hard-to-explain calf loss, it could be one of these two types of Clostridium conditions where the elements have come together to create the so-called perfect storm here.
Absolutely. And like I said, our normal 7-way vaccines, they have the C, they have a D, but we don't have an A. We used to have a vaccine that was specifically for Clostridium perfringens A. That will no longer be on the market. And so if practitioners and producers think that a herd should vaccinate specifically for A, then they're going to have to go the autogenous route of vaccine production for that herd.
And that's a whole different pathway.
That's a whole different pathway, which takes actually, unfortunately, having an animal that succumbs from the disease, send that into the laboratory so that we can grow the Clostridium, and then it takes an application to the state to use the vaccine in the herd. A company's got to grow the bacteria and make the vaccine. So there's a lot of hoops for autogenous vaccines. They do have their place, but yeah, unfortunately, this commercial vaccines off the market are going to be shortly.
Yeah. Again, that discussion with your veterinarian would be essential here if, in fact, you have seen calves that have succumbed to this toxic condition created by these Clostridium issues in the gut. Purple gut, Greg says, is what this is often referred to out in the field. Hopefully, this will come to an end for producers here soon if they're battling this. Greg, thanks for explaining what might be going on out there with these conditions. It's always good to have you over. Gregg Hanzlicek, Mike's side, from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State. He joins us monthly to discuss current developments in the area of bovine health management here in Kansas. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and now we'll stand aside for a few moments, returning with more for you here on the K-State Radio Network. Please stay with us.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. And next up, today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, 5 years after the planned listing of the lesser prairie chicken in the Endangered Species Act was dropped, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service last week announced a proposed rule to reverse course. The service submitted a draft rule to the Federal Register saying that the bird is facing extinction. Now, the proposal was met with disappointment from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association as well as the Public Lands Council, both of whom said on Friday that progress toward protecting the species was being made through voluntary conservation measures. The Fish and Wildlife Service decision designates two distinct population segments of the species now. The northern population, covering southeastern Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and the northeast Texas Panhandle, will list the birds as threatened, not endangered. The southern population in New Mexico and the southwest Texas Panhandle will list the species as endangered. Now, the service said in its announcement that the lesser prairie chicken once numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Aerial surveys from 2012 to 2020, however, they say, estimate a 5-year average lesser prairie chicken population of just over 27,000 across the 5-state region. It is estimated, says the service, that lesser prairie chicken habitat has diminished across its historical range by about 90%. Back in 2016, you'll recall, the U.S. Department of Justice decided to drop an appeal of a district court decision ending its pursuit of listing the lesser prairie chicken as endangered through the act. The service announced a plan to protect the species back in 2014, and in July of 15, the agency cited lesser prairie chickens were in fact growing in population. At the time, increases were observed in 3 of the 4 bird ecoregions across Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. And aerial surveys by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies led to estimates that the bird's population increased nearly 50% since the 2013 drought here in Kansas. As rainfall returned to historical levels since 2014, the bird's population has increased. There's been no dampening of global demand for U.S. agricultural products in spite of higher commodity prices, according to the USDA's lead economist. Gary Crawford has more.
As everyone knows, since last August, we've seen prices for agricultural commodities rising to pretty high levels. Normally, that reduces demand and causes a retraction in export sales of ag products. However,
we haven't seen them back off the way you might have thought with these rising prices.
Agriculture Department Chief Economist Seth Meyer says instead it's been an interesting time for global ag trade.
China comes into the market, takes bigger volumes, that drives prices higher. That's higher prices to our other customers, and yet in dollar terms, they didn't back off, right? So even as these prices continue to rise, we still continue to do pretty solid export to the rest of the world, too.
USDA projecting record exports this fiscal year. Now, Meyer says something unexpected could happen to throw a monkey wrench into things, a trade dispute or a big disease outbreak. But aside from that kind of thing,
I think it is a very solid story for the rest of the year.
This is Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And as the Biden administration released its $6 trillion budget request to Congress for fiscal year 22, it included the USDA's budget, which proposes an increase in discretionary spending, while the costs of its mandatory programs are expected to decline. The funding would be 9% higher than fiscal year 21, about $2.6 billion higher, the bulk of which would go toward higher spending for nutrition programs, but also for proposed increases in funding for rural development, conservation, the Forest Service, food safety, and research. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning some different thoughts on heat stress management. You know, a lot of times when we talk about heat stress management on our dairy farms, we really focus on cow cooling, and those things are very, very important. But I want to take a little bit different approach this morning. We might want to think about things like THI. Do you realize that for every 10-point increase in THI, there's good research out there that shows that rumination decreases by 1 hour per day, and milk production declines by about 6 pounds. So as we think about this, maybe we should also focus on things that might improve rumen function. So what are those things? Well, number one, you might want to think about direct-fed microbials. You know, we've got some very good products out there that actually contain live yeast cells that actually have been shown to increase feed efficiency as well as milk yield, especially energy-corrected milk. A lot of times the feed efficiency is increased by about 7%, and the yield of energy-corrected milk, sometimes by as much as almost 6%. So that usually results in about a 5-to-1 return on investment for what we paid for those microbials. So you might want to consider those if you're not using those today. That's an interesting twist on how to help your animals withstand heat stress. Second thing you need to look at is forage quality. You know, a lot of times we have silages that heat during the summertime because of face exposure because they weren't put up correctly. So we have a lot of secondary fermentation. This does three things to the animal. It reduces their intake, it reduces the available energy that they're receiving from the diet, and this results in a reduction in milk production. This often offsets some of the things that we're trying to do to improve rumen function, like feeding the direct-fed microbials that I just spoke about. So if you have issues with forage quality, you need to take care of that, particularly look at secondary fermentation, which is higher in your silages during the summer, making sure that we do a good job this next year as we put up silages to avoid those situations. And then finally, just kind of some of the basics that we sometimes forget about, making sure that we have adequate water in the pen. We should have space for at least 15% of the animals to drink at any one time, or 3 inches of linear space per cow in the pen. You know, a lot of times our facilities contain more animals than what they were originally designed for. So the original design maybe had adequate water space in it, but today, if we're looking at stocking those barns at 120, 130%, we probably don't have enough water space unless we added it to the barn. The other things that you might look at during the summertime is the timing of feeding and what you do with push-up. This will help avoid sorting in the diet, which again will help improve the rumen function of your animals. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to look at things other than just heat stress abatement ideas for our farms as we try to help our animals make it through summer heat stress.
All right, Mike, many thanks. And we'll be back in a moment on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
This Agriculture Today comes to a close, as it usually does on a Tuesday, with another word on wildlife management from former Research and Extension wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. Charlie, you've more research to cover for us today on this subject that we've touched upon in various ways before, that is, the transmission of toxicants, in this case rodenticides, to wildlife through the consumption of rodents that took in those toxicants. And this is a recurring question.
Well, we do know that people have problems with rodents, and rodents can have detrimental impacts on human dwellings, grain storage facilities, food storage, as well as public health. As a result of that, there are lots of anticoagulants or rodenticides that have been developed over time to control populations of these commensal rodents, primarily for Norway rats. And studies in California and elsewhere have been very good at illustrating the impact of second-generation anticoagulants showing up in the carcasses of wildlife species. And you would expect that they have to be eating the product directly, or they have to be getting it in some way by feeding on carcasses that have consumed the product. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a negative fate associated with consuming that product, but in some cases, yes, that has been demonstrated, that secondary effects of feeding on second-generation anticoagulants can end up in killing other species.
Well, it's toward that latter possibility that this research was designed, to look at the possible pathway of rodenticides to wildlife by consuming carcasses.
Yeah, this particular study was designed to investigate the removal rates of rat carcasses from residential backyards in suburban areas of Orange County, California. The objectives were to determine the removal rates of the rat carcasses from residential areas and to identify the types of wildlife species that find and that are capable of consuming the carcasses, which would potentially expose them to the rodenticides.
There were several variables that were examined specifically here that might affect that consumption, you say.
Yeah, also they kept track of the yard characteristics. Vegetation density was labeled as either high, medium, or low. The presence or absence of anthropogenic food sources like pet food or bird seed, anything that was out there that was additional food provided by humans, whether water was in the yard or pets in the area, as well as the barrier type around the property. And the barrier types were identified as being solid, either brick or wood or solid plastic fencing, chain link fencing, plastic slatted fencing, or no barrier at all. And then they took carcasses of domestic rats, which were, you can purchase those as pet food, and placed them in 20 residential yards throughout Orange County, California. 19 of those were in the backyards of Orange County master gardeners. The yards were monitored with a infrared digital camera that captured images of the carcass, either visitation or removal, and the rat carcasses were anchored to the ground with a metal cable that was anchored into the ground, and the camera was set up directly nearby the carcass to capture images of wildlife and their interaction with that carcass.
Then did they find, as one looks at the results, that wildlife do aggressively consume these carcasses, and which wildlife would be in that habit?
Yeah, they found that the rat carcasses were discovered very quickly. 95% of them were discovered within the 7 days that the trial lasted, and 65% of them were removed, and 35% of those carcasses were removed within the first 24 hours. That suggests that carcass consumption could be a very significant pathway for secondary rodenticide exposure in these urban and suburban environments. We know that if it's available and if wildlife is nearby, they're probably going to eventually find it. In this particular study, they found that after the 7 days, the cameras then were all retrieved. The extent of the carcass removal was noted, and then they determined the yard characteristics and tried to analyze the data.
And found out what about those characteristics?
Well, they found that the areas that had the lowest vegetation density and the highest permeability, I guess, if you will, of the outside barrier, the outside fencing, and the presence of pets and water and human-supplied food also increased the likelihood and speed at which predators found the carcasses. So that tells me that the animals that were finding the rat carcasses included coyotes, free-roaming cats, striped skunks, and other rats were the species that investigated the carcasses. Also, opossums were investigating carcasses. Primarily, they were finding the carcasses in the yards that had the fences. So there are lots of different species that are able to get into yards. Even though you may think you have them fenced, it's not much for an opossum to climb over a solid wood or stone brick fence. And they were able to find these carcasses even in those situations.
In the end, then, can it be safely said, based on this research anyway, that, yes, there is this connection between rodents that consume rodenticides and those rodenticides eventually ending up in predatory wildlife?
Yes, this appears to be certainly a pathway for the movement of those rodenticides into wildlife species. I think EPA has done a lot to try to prevent second-generation anticoagulants from being made available to people that are not professionally trained in how to use rodenticides, and tried to restrict access to some of those products. Hopefully that will start to show up as some impacts. But based on the number of wildlife species that have been found by California, I think we have to do a little bit more. We've got to do more to try to keep the rodenticides into the target species and out of those non-targets wildlife that we all enjoy.
Well, another research adding to the body of information on this important topic. Thanks, Charlie, once more, as always. He's along with us each week is former wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. And that wraps up our Tuesday edition. We appreciate you being along with us. Please rejoin us here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.